Welcome back to our series on pivoting in TSQL. So we're talking about the pivot function inside of TSQL, so Microsoft SQL Server. In our previous video, we basically introduced that particular function. So we saw it with a very basic example, and then we moved up to a more complicated example. So first example, we just took one column, and we took certain values from that column, and we had them serve as column headers, and then we specified another column that we have serve as the values. And we see that with pivoting, we're kind of restricted in certain things. So we have to always use an aggregation, and we cannot use the same column twice if we were to do multiple aggregations on different columns. And so this is basically where we left off on our previous example. And so we kind of saw that with that one. It was more complex because we had to do two pivot functions. Each one had to basically take a copy of the column, of the same column that they were pivoting. So in some cases, it's a little bit more complicated than others. What we're going to talk about in this video is the concept of dynamic pivot queries. And so the idea behind a dynamic pivot query is pretty straightforward. I'm going to take this query and I'm going to put it over here. And then I'm going to close this one. Okay. So we can see here that with our particular data set, we do have some columns that we would expect to change, and we expect the value to change in that column. Now, technically all of them will, but more specifically, I'm talking about that year and month column. So imagine somebody came up to you and said, hey, do a pivot with every year we've had. Well, in some cases, if data is constantly being added to the table, well, that means you would have to constantly change your query. So that way it incorporates the latest year, month, so on and so on. Now, what we can do is we can actually write our query in such a way that we can make it dynamic. So that way, if there's new values that are added to a particular column, we can identify those new values and then just incorporate them into a pre-existing pivot query that we have built. So that's the idea behind dynamic pivot queries, is that they're dynamic in the sense of they will adapt to new values being added to a particular column. Now, what it requires us doing is pre-writing certain queries and storing them as strings, and then using certain functions inside of TSQL to quote unquote execute those strings. But really what it's doing is it's executing a query. It's just that that query is written as a single string. Now, that's the simple part. I would say more complicated part is getting the string properly formatted, so that way it is valid SQL syntax, because if it's not, then obviously we can't execute it. So that's usually where people, I would say, get most confused, is they're like, why are you doing all these extra steps? It's probably for formatting. Okay, so our goal is to have it where our query will automatically pull all the distinct year values inside of our year column. So the first thing that we got to do is we got to declare some variables inside of our query. To declare a variable, you do declare, so the declare keyword, you use the @ sign, and then you give your variable name. So we'll call it @columns. Now this will serve as our column values. And then your variable needs to have a data type, so we'll just give it nvarchar, and we'll use the max keyword. So basically with this one, if we don't know how many characters are going to be in it, we just say, just do the max that you can possibly do. I don't know the max off the top of my head, but it's a very big number. Okay, so that will be our @columns variable. This will store all the distinct values inside of our year column. And then the next one will be @query, and then this will also be an nvarchar max. And with this one, this will store our actual SQL query. So here, declare our variables. Okay, so that's okay. This is everything at this point, hopefully not too complicated. The next couple parts, I'm going to break out a big step into little steps. Now, normally you don't write it like this, but for, I would say, educational purposes, it just is a little bit more intuitive to understand what's happening as you kind of look at this long line that has many different functions inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the end result, and we're going to basically explain how we get there and what it's doing. So this is ultimately what we're going to be building, is this line right here. What it's doing, and it's going to look a little funny at first because you're going to say that's it. And then you're like, yep. Is it's basically building this. It's just a string that has all the values. But there's a lot going on here. So we're using this stuff function. We're selecting some stuff. We're using quote name, and then we're using XML path and type, and then value, and then we're doing all sorts of other stuff. So there's a lot that's going on in this one line. I think it's helpful to kind of just break it out line by line and understand what we're doing at each point. So the first thing that we need to get is we need to get all the distinct values from our particular column that we're basically wanting to turn dynamic. So what that looks like is we can use the select distinct. So the distinct keyword will only return unique values. We specify the column that we want to select, and then it's the same as before. We still select from that particular table that we're planning to get the data from. So all this returns is a unique list of all the values in that column. So there are no duplicates. So we have this list of unique values, but technically we need them to be what we would want. Well, basically what we want them to be is strings, and then on top of that, we need it to be formatted a particular way. So what we're going to do next is we're going to use this quote name function, right? Because if you notice up here, every time we auto-generate a query, it's surrounded by brackets. That's usually a good thing. That's to make sure that if your column name has spaces in it or something like that, SQL won't freak out. So if you don't have brackets and you had spaces in your column name, SQL would freak out and be like, I don't know what to do. If you surround it by these little, I don't even know what to call them at this point, the square brackets, then you can have a space in your column name. What the quote name function does is it basically wraps each one of your values inside those square brackets, okay? So let's see what we get when we do that. So here is select all the unique values from the quote unquote year column. So that's basically the first portion. Wrap those values in square brackets. Okay, so I'm just going to take this one right here and I'll show you what it's going to do. So we'll say quote. Oh, I'm picky about this. I always try to do uppercase. I'm sure some people go like, Alex, stop. You can see that all it did is it simply wrapped those those values in the square brackets. Now, you can also see here that each one of them has a preceding comma in front of it. So we also need to add that component as well. And so that's basically what this little guy right here is doing, is it's just basically turning each value into a formatted string that we can then join together. So if I add this comma in front of it, because now this is technically a string, it will just concatenate it on for us. And so you can see it looks good. We still have an issue because technically there shouldn't be a comma on the first value, but we'll deal with that in a second. At this point, we have pretty much everything we need. Now we're going to kind of go to the more, I would call, complicated part. So inside of SQL, there is an XML type. And so with XML, we understand that it's basically just a way of storing data. So it has things, tags that wrap around it. So that way you can easily identify, I would say, repetitive values that belong to maybe a particular column or something like that. So it's just a way of formatting data so that way you can easily parse it. Now, like I said before, SQL does have an XML type. And so basically the solution for building this dynamic query is we convert it to an XML type and we define the path or the tag that we want each row value to be added to it. So really what it's doing is it's going to, I would say, aggregate all these rows into a single row, and it's going to surround each value with an XML tag that we specify. So personally, the way I learn this topic is I just will show it to you because I think it's a little bit easier to understand what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this one right here. Is we're going to use the XML type inside of our query. Now, what it does is it's going to return this row set as XML content. So the syntax is simply for XML, and then there's this other keyword called path. Now there's technically other values it can take on, but at this point, we're just going to be using path. You call this the mode. So right now our mode is path. And with path, what we're saying is it's basically adding a certain level of flexibility to the query. So that way you can specify the tag that you want it to be. So it's a more flexible way of doing it. At least at this point, that's all you need to know. But we do need to specify it because it does specify the mode for us and it will give us some customizability. So let's see what this one right here will return. Okay, so you can see it's basically just a giant XML component, and you can actually see right here, if you were to click into it, this is how it would come out. So it's just XML content, and because we didn't specify anything in the tag, it just automatically uses the default one, which is row. Now, technically, you don't have to have it be the default one. You could have the tag be something like year. And so it's going to change that row value to year. And you can clearly see now it's year. Now, in our particular example, we don't want it to be anything. We actually want it to be blank. So what we're going to do is we're going to just set it to a blank string. With this one, you can now see it's getting closer to what we want when we're trying to build this dynamic query. So that's what this portion is doing. Convert row set to XML content and set path to a blank string. So all it did is it took the result of this row set, it converted it to XML content, so just aggregating it in essence to a single row. And with XML, you can specify the tag, how you want it to be. Now, if you don't specify it, the default tag is row. Now, in our particular example, we want our row to just be, or sorry, the row tag to be blank. And we'll understand in a second why that is. Okay. Now, there's some other components to it. And the next one is what we call type. So, we have this XML content and we want to access the values inside of this XML content. How do we do that? Well, what we can do is we can take this particular query at this point, and at the end of it, we can basically wrap it all in a select statement. And what we can do is we can do select and then comma type. The type keyword, at least in this example, is basically saying you want it to be treated as an XML type inside of SQL. That's all you're saying at this point. When you do this, you can then access the value from an XML type in SQL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to access that value, and there's a couple key arguments that we pass through in our value function, I guess, if you want to call it that. The first one is what we call the X query. So this basically defines the query that you want to perform on the XML content. Now, you probably know from experience that XML content can be very nested in nature. And so this is where you're writing that query. So you can say root. Okay, once you go past the root, go down to the year. Okay, once you go down to the year, go down to the month. Now, in our example, our XML content doesn't have any tags, and there's really no depth to it. And so in this case, we're just going to pass through that and just say, just bring us back that content. And then you have to specify how you want it to be returned as a SQL type. So for example, there might be content in that XML content that is not the correct type. And so this is your opportunity to specify it as the right type. And so in my case, I can't always guarantee it's going to be the same. So what we'll do is we'll just use nvarchar max. And let's see what we get when we do that. Oh, my apologies. I shouldn't have done that. It's lowercase. This is a case where it's actually lowercase. So at this point, you can now see it's just a string. So it's no longer an XML type content. It's just a raw string. And it's now, well, we know it's a raw string because we converted it after we accessed each value. So now that we've done that, this is where we access the value and convert it to the proper data type. Great. Hopefully nothing too crazy. And then we get to this point. So this is basically the final step of our process. So use the stuff function to remove the leading comma. This is literally the only reason we're using the stuff function. So with the stuff function, what it does is it inserts a string into another string. So basically, this at this point is our giant string, right? So this is our giant string if you want to think about it. Yeah, it's a messy query, but in essence, we've validated that all this is returning is a string. So our stuff function is going to take this string, and we specify the character that we want to replace. Now, in this case, what I'm saying is take the first character to the first character. So basically just the first character, replace it with nothing. So replace it with a blank string. We can see that that first character right now is simply a comma. We don't want that leading comma. So this one will remove that leading comma and replace it with a blank string. So again, stuff function takes a string, you specify the starting character and the ending character, and then you specify the string you want to replace in between those two, that starting and ending point. So that's why after you do that, you will no longer see that leading comma. Oh, sorry. You can now see, and it might be a little hard to see, but there's no leading comma there anymore. So very useful. That was the complicated part. That was the hard part. Now comes, I would call it the easier part, right? Because we've actually written most of this before. So at this point, nothing's too crazy. So now that we've defined the columns, or I would call it the dynamic portion of our pivot, we're now going to build our query again. Now, the nice thing is we've built this before, so we don't really kind of have to do too much again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my new query, and we're going to set @query equal, and it's going to be a string. Now it's going to be a multi-line string, so you just have to make sure you wrap it. And to save ourselves some time, I'm assuming most people at this point understand how this is all working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, it's kind of a little bit different than what we did before, but for right now, it's okay. It's going to change a little bit, but it's not too bad. And as you can tell, I also wrote notes, so the one that I post on GitHub will be a lot more detailed. I'm sure you wanted that. I know most of you hate when I write the documentation. Who doesn't? Okay, so we have this string. We're going to put another quotation mark, and we're going to do plus sign. We're going to add in our columns, and then we're going to do from. Well, what we can do here is we can just take that, and then I will, again, this is just more for readability. I just want to kind of clean it up so it's not this like crazy long string or anything like that. And then what I'll do is I will and then I'm going to do that. I'm like double checking because it's easy for this part to make mistakes. I've done it multiple times, so I try to make sure I'm not doing it again. And sometimes if you don't do it correctly, it will freak out on you, and it's kind of hard to kind of debug it because you got this string and it's not really clear as to where in the string it's going wrong, and you know, all that fun stuff. So a lot of times I try to make sure this step, I take it nice and slow. Sales data pivot, sales pivot by year. Okay. Good. Okay, good. I think this is fine. We'll see in a second. If it fails, it fails. So I'll do select and then at query, and hopefully we get a nice clean query string. Hopefully. Okay, so this is basically what it did, is it just created a big old query string that we did before, but now it's dynamic where it's basically now incorporating those columns as they're being added. So this was the second portion. Now we execute that query. So execute the final query. And so we're going to do execute and then at query, and hopefully we get the results that we want. Uh-oh. Oh, I forgot the mistake. Silly me, silly me. Technically, I'm supposed to have this at columns here too. So that was my bad. Hopefully that does fix the issue. I hope it does. Good, it seems like it did. So just as a reiteration, I did forget that I have to add the columns here because we remember with pivots, we have to specify the columns that we want to serve as column headers. And in this case, if we want it to be dynamic in the sense of it just does everybody, then we have to make sure we include it here. But we can see that it did exactly what we wanted. Now, it didn't do anything fancy like rename the columns and stuff like that. You know, there's ways to do that. I mean, if people want to see, you know, how to do that, I'd be happy to do another video on it. But at this point, this is how you build dynamic queries. So this is how you build dynamic queries inside of TSQL. If you're interested, you know, let me know if you'd like to see maybe how to do multiple columns. I would be more than happy to research that. I couldn't find too many examples. I don't think I found any examples. I didn't try too often though, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested in seeing that, I'd be happy to do it. And then, yeah. So yeah, if you have any questions, you know, feel free to put them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. What's coming up next? Next one, we're going to do unpivot. So unpivot's going to be a little bit shorter of a series just because for the most part, it's pretty similar to pivot. So I don't have to go into a certain amount of detail like I was doing before. It's it's generally the same idea. You're just doing everything in reverse. But we'll see how to do unpivot, and then we'll also do dynamic unpivoting as well too. So really cool stuff. I think you guys will enjoy that as well. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.